The previous lesson was spent examining the structure, roles, and functions of the cabinet within the UK's political system. This lesson is going to focus less on the structure of the institution, i.e., the cabinet, and more on the individual actors within the cabinet, that being government ministers. Now, government ministers does not necessarily refer to the exact number of people who exist in the cabinet, but broadly within the structure of the executive as a whole, but it does also include members of the cabinet. So, we're going to examine the nature of government ministers. We're going to talk about the roles and powers they have, but spend a lot of time talking about one of the most important elements of the government's ministerial structure, which is, of course, that of the idea of collective responsibility. There are more than 100 government ministers within the UK's system. Senior ministers will hold the rank of Secretary of State and will therefore sit in the cabinet and head government departments. We know already you have Secretary of State for the Home Department, you have Secretary of State for Education, Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs, the Foreign Secretary, etc., etc. All of these individuals are known as senior ministers. They hold the rank of Secretary of State. Below them are a hierarchy of other ministers, and they become ministers of state and part of the parliamentary undersecretary. These can be described as junior ministers. In terms of ministerial roles, the main roles that are performed by ministers, whether they are senior or junior, are as follows. They have a certain leadership role when it comes to party leadership and policy leadership. A minister does not have the time to play a hands-on role in all of the detailed policy discussions, and so they act as leaders on policy issues and delegate and direct the essential direction that policy will go. They also represent departmental interest. Ministers will represent the interests of their departments in cabinet and often negotiate for funding increases. It is often done through the idea of funding that we see the role of ministers in their representative administrative roles be represented the most. They also have the role of departmental management. Ministers will play strategic roles in managing the world of their department. They will manage the individuals within their department. They act as the heads of these departments, specifically senior ministers do, and therefore will play the role of managing the department that they head. They also have two roles when it comes to the relationship that is had with Parliament. On the one hand, they will put their bills through the parliamentary process. The parliamentary process is what we looked at in the previous chapter for A-level politics, which is, of course, the reading stages. You have the first reading, second reading, committee stage, report stage, third reading, and then the final point is it goes to the House of Lords. This is the first of the main ministerial roles that is done in relation to Parliament. But the second one, which is arguably more important in some cases, is the fact that ministers are held accountable to Parliament. Parliament has the role of holding ministers to account. They do so through various different committee systems. They do so through ministerial questions. They do so by scrutinising the legislation that is put through as bills in the parliamentary process. So now that we've talked about the roles of government ministers within the executive departments, what about the principle of collective responsibility? I've cited and I've highlighted the principle of collective responsibility briefly in previous lessons, but I haven't gone into it in enough detail, and that's what this rest of this lesson is going to examine. The idea of collective responsibility comes out of the principle that the cabinet is supposed to be a unified, united institution, a unified body. And so ministers are usually members of the same party. And so if you are members of the same party, you stand on an agreed manifesto at the general election. Collective responsibility, therefore, is a core principle of establishing a collective government. It is the principle that all members of government are responsible as a group, and so, as such, by convention, they must represent a united front. They must appear to be collective in their decision-making and collective in their consensus in relation to government decisions that are made. Now, we can derive three main elements from the Convention of Collective Responsibility. The first is the idea of secrecy. Ministers must keep the details of discussions in the cabinet system a secret. This is very simple and easy to understand. The point here is to ensure the retention of sensitive information as well as the retention of disagreement. It prevents information from becoming part of the public domain. So you can disagree as a minister with the decisions that are being taken or could be taken by the rest of the government. You can disagree as vocally and as aggressively as you like, but it has to be done so under the banner of secrecy from the rest of the public domain. So you can disagree in cabinet, you can disagree with one-on-one meetings with various other colleagues, but as soon as this becomes a public policy, as soon as it becomes front-facing and becomes public domain, you have to either resign, and therefore you can criticize as much as you want, or you have to show a collective front. And this brings into question the second part of collective responsibility, the idea that we have binding decisions. Once a decision is reached in cabinet, it becomes binding onto all members of the cabinet, regardless of whether or not they were opposed to it or not. You can voice your opposition, as I've said, in as many ways as you like in cabinet, but if you then are opposed to it, and after a decision has been reached, you have to be bound to that decision. It is binding onto you unless you want to resign. If you disagree with cabinet decisions, you have two options. You must show a united front and support it publicly, or you must resign if you want to publicly criticize it. What is quite interesting is seeing the many ministers that of course want to retain their position within government actually opt for the first option, which shows very much when we look at how the media represents these ministers trying to be publicly enthusiastic about a policy that they clearly have been opposed to and were opposed to in government, and so they have to try and make the best of a bad situation and try and pretend that they actually agree with a policy that they clearly hate. But a lot of ministers may also just decide to resign instead, so that they do have the ability to publicly criticise it. For example, Caroline Flint in 2009 would resign from cabinet on account of allegations of Brown's leadership. The entire government must resign if it is defeated in a confidence vote. This last happened in 1979 when James Callaghan's Labour government lost a vote of confidence after its bill on Scottish devolution was defeated in the Commons. So this is just an extra additional element relating to collective responsibility. The collective government itself resigned in its entirety when a confidence vote was issued. Now, moving away now from the descriptive realities of the ways in which collective responsibility works, what about the argument of whether or not we still have collective responsibility? So if you were asked an exam question as to basically asking you to assess whether a collective responsibility is still effective or whether we still have it, or what the strengths and weaknesses of collective responsibility are, what would we do? Well, the argument has been here suggested in the last few decades that collective responsibility has eroded. Why do people have this view in mind? Well, we have issues relating to, for example, temporary suspension. The Prime Minister is able to suspend collective responsibility temporarily on the various issues, in reality on whatever issues they so choose. So this is supposed to ensure that there isn't a mass resignation of ministers on an issue that is potentially very divisive and so could cause the mass resignation of ministers. So what happens is the Prime Minister is able to temporarily suspend collective responsibility to allow ministers to critique the government and still retain in office. So one example here for the mass resignation of ministers can be seen with the Johnson resignation that takes place last year in 2022, when we see Boris Johnson retain authority or maintain power as long as humanly possible, when it became clear that nearly 100 ministers had resigned en masse in protest of his retaining of the prime ministerial office. It became very clear that he was unable to maintain his position as prime minister, and so as a result had to resign. Harold Wilson allowed ministers to campaign for either yes or no during the 1975 referendum on membership to the European Economic Community, which is very, very ironic given the fact that in 2016 David Cameron allowed his ministers to do exactly the same thing on the referendum on whether or not we remain members of the European Union. Famously, we see Michael Gove and Boris Johnson go against David Cameron's wishes, essentially, and to act against collective responsibility by going against David Cameron and campaigning for the Leave campaign rather than for the Remainers. We can also challenge the view of collective responsibility on the basis of the growth in leaks that takes place. Disgruntled ministers and their advisors may sometimes simply leak information on cabinet discussions to the media to basically get their disgruntled ideas out to the media without actually coming clean and saying it was them that did the leaking, and also therefore violating collective responsibility. They may want to air their dissatisfaction with the cabinet decisions publicly, but they don't want to resign, so they do so just by leaking the information out. Cabinet discussions have also been made public in diaries written by cabinet ministers, such as individuals such as Tony Benn and Robin Cook. And then finally we have the issue of dissent and non-resignation. Cabinet ministers who oppose important aspects of government policy have survived in office even if their concerns were made public. Remember, collective responsibility is merely a constitutional convention. It is not something that is legally binding onto members. They don't necessarily have to critique government and resign, or resign then critique government, or show a united front. It is just a general rule of thumb that is practiced by members. For example, Wets in Thatcher's first cabinet were making it very public their opposition to government economic policy. In fact, a number of members of Thatcher's cabinet were opposed to a number of issues relating to Thatcher's economic policy for almost the entirety of her tenureship in office. The poll tax is a very good example of critique of her regime and ultimately led to her fall from authority. There was also dissent regarding concerns about the legality and the ethicality of the 2003 invasion of Iraq in the Blair governments. Some cabinet ministers who served under Thatcher and Blair also believed that the Prime Minister had undermined collective responsibility by ignoring decisions and votes by cabinets. Caroline Flint, for example, resigned from Brown's cabinet in 2009, accusing him of running a two-tier government system with an inner circle which included very few women and was, as such, was discriminatory against women. This is something that relates to this idea of prime ministerial dominance. If the Prime Minister himself or herself decides not to even go along with and agree with cabinet ministers' decisions, then aren't they ignoring their own principle of collective responsibility in that regard? In addition to collective responsibility, we have the principle of individual ministerial responsibility, and this is the idea that ministers are held accountable to Parliament for their own personal conduct. This is again a convention and not necessarily a rigid practice. And one of the things that should be noted in relation to this is, what about the ministerial responsibility for actions that are done under their watch but have not been done with their knowledge? The Home Secretary, Sir David Maxwell Fyfe, in 1954 once said that ministers cannot be held responsible for the decisions that are taken by civil servants which they had no knowledge of or potentially they disagreed with and they did without their approval. Ministers are not obligated to resign if failings are traceable to actions of civil servants, but they are responsible for informing Parliament of the actions of their department and being the figurehead for the decisions that are made within their department itself.